And so I don't know how many people believe in like spiritual warfare, believe in good and evil and all of these types of things. But, I'm not trying to convince anybody, but like I'm just sharing with you what my story is. And I don't know when people say somebody's trying to sell their soul, somebody's doing this and that, for the fame, for the money, all this type of stuff. I don't know how all of this stuff works, but I'm one of them people that I believe that, you know, there are good and evil and stuff that, you know, like we just deal with in this world. And so for me, like I'm just sharing my story and I know what happened to me. And yeah, so anyway, as I share this story, I will protect people in some instances as far as like, not including names. But there was a case of three brothers. And so, what I'll do is for the older brother, I'll refer to him as B1. The middle brother, I refer to him as B2. And then the younger brother, I refer to him as B3. Even though the younger brother really is not, in as deep or whatever. And then also, including the mother of these three in as well. But yeah, so anyway, I was probably about 15. Well, when I kind of met the guy, whatever, when I met B1, I was probably about maybe 15, 16 years old. And so probably closer to about 16 years old. And B1 was a lot older than I was. And so, you know, going in this situation, it started with other things. So I was a part of a rap group. We were in Louisville and, just kind of up and coming and stuff. And, people were gravitating to our music or whatnot. Me being young, me just being in the streets and stuff, here was a guy that I met. So with B1, we just kind of gravitated toward each other. And B1 was a lot older, so he was considered like an OG. B1 just kind of took me under his wing like a little brother. And so, like, giving you a little bit of a background, we would, kind of hit the spot or whatever out there doing what we was doing, selling drugs and whatnot. And so a lot of times what we would do, we smoked a lot of weed. We did a lot of stuff like that. I remember being over his house, and it was a house that he had bought for his mother and stuff, but he also lived there as well. And so I just remember just being around him, and a lot of times like what would happen is like he would buy a bunch of weed and stuff or whatnot. And so I'm talking about like pounds of weed, and we would just roll and roll and roll, and it was just like we was always just smoking and stuff a lot. And so in this time of my life, I had been questioning God, kind of more agnostic. And so I believed that God existed, but, my family on my mother's side were more Jehovah's Witness. And I was just kind of like, I felt like God was real, but I just didn't think that he was in that. And so, therefore, I was just kind of, I was aware of God, but I really didn't, know if he existed or I didn't know how he existed. And so, yeah, so going through all of this, I remember, I'm gonna take you back to a situation. I remember when Eazy-E, everybody know Eazy-E. I remember when Eazy-E died, and he died of AIDS and stuff. And so I just remember rumors going around, man, Eazy-E done sold his soul and he did all this type of stuff or whatever. And, this was, how quick he died. People was just saying, man, he sold his soul and stuff like that, man. I just remember being over at my grandmother's house, which, she was a Jehovah's Witness. And I just remember being by myself one day and kind of lighthearted, but also serious as well. I was just like, I wonder if a person could sell their soul and stuff. And I just, just kind of lighthearted. But like I said, it's kind of lighthearted, but serious as well. But like, hey, if you can sell your soul, hey, you can take my soul for a little bit of money and, a little bit of the fame and stuff like this, all this or whatever. Like I said, I was lightweight, serious, but, whatever. I was just kind of half-hearted with it, but I was just like, I would just wonder if it's true and stuff. And so fast forward on, like I said, I ran into this guy, B1. And so, we was kicking it and stuff, real tight and stuff. And I know as I was young growing up, I seen a lot of stuff going on. And I always used to question God, like, is this all my life is going to be? Am I just going to, like sell drugs until one day, I'm stuck on drugs myself? I'm on the opposite end of the spectrum and stuff. And so like I just used to always ask, like, God, is life bigger than this? Just the hood, the things that I was seeing. I remember hooking up with B1, and B1 was the type of guy, like, we could be smoking, he had big speakers and stuff in the house, and we just listening to a bunch of like DJ Screw, 8 by MJG, a whole bunch of different stuff, Tupac, whoever. And at times, dude would just like, I'm talking about, man, we probably 5, 6 blunts in smoking, and he would basically, his CD changes, disc changer and stuff or whatever on the music, like it would change over and he just listening to like Yolanda Adams or Kurt Franklin or something like this. And it's just like out of the blue, like we had him and dudes just like, listening to, some gospel music and stuff. And then, at certain times, as we are smoking, he might turn on the TV, ESPN, something like this, and then he'll flip to a channel and it's like, the 10 Commandments or something, and he just running it down, bruh. Like, do you know about this, and that, or whatever? And so in my young mind, I'm thinking like, dude, like he's probably answering some of the questions that I've had with God. Because, here's a guy who I felt like knew everything about the streets, but then at the same time, he's showing me everything that he knows biblically. And so seemingly it's like he has a connection with God. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking like, dang, man, maybe God has put me in front of this guy to be able to be an example for me, to show me like, yeah, God is real. You can still do what you're doing and then also serve God and stuff too. So in my mind, I'm just like, man, this might be the perfect guy that I needed to, answer some of the questions that I had. I just remember, at certain times, like, I spent summers and stuff over this guy's house. And so B1 and B2, B2 was around my age. And so B1 would allow B2 to come into the room sometime and just smoke with us and, just get high with us and stuff. And so kind of fast forward, and I'm just telling you some of the background of that. We used to smoke together, we used to get high together and stuff. And I remember later, when me and my friend, we ended up getting our CD done, our music CD done. And dude was like, B1 was like, hey, when y'all get y'all CDs done, let me know, and I, buy a bunch of them and then just, give them out throughout the hood and stuff. And so, I took him up on that. So, I kind of distanced myself because, I wanted to stop smoking weed and stuff or whatever. And so before I stopped and pulled myself away, I remember B2 just stopped smoking weed. And, times that I would come over to B1's house, I would ask, hey, where's B2 at? And he's like, man, he just, he's in his room. And for whatever reason, he had locked himself in his room, and all he was doing was just, he would come out to use the bathroom, but he was just primarily in his room just reading the Bible. And I would ask B1, where's B2? He's like, man, he's just in his room reading the Bible. And I'm like, I thought that was kind of weird, but also I thought it was kind of dope. Like, okay, I guess, these guys take a little season to do this stuff or whatever, like, understand the word and this and that. Fast forward in that, I remember being in a relationship with me and my girlfriend at the time. And so I just kind of stayed away from, the hood and all of this stuff. She had an apartment and, I would go over to her apartment and stuff. And I just felt like it was kind of a safe haven away from all of the stuff that I was always dealing with. So I remember going over B1's house with my girlfriend after we got the CDs pressed up, right? And so we got our CDs out and I'm like, okay, let's take him up on the promise or whatever that he said that he would buy these CDs. I went up to talk to B1, but then I introduced my girlfriend to B1's mother. And so I remember me and B1 talking, it was a situation to where, he wanted to get some stuff and I had a connect for him. So I ended up hooking him up with the connect. And so we over B1's house and my girlfriend, she had, came to the bottom of the stairs and she's calling me, she was like, Damien. And I'm like, what's up? She's like, come on, it's time to go. And I'm just like, what you mean it's time to go? And so me and B1 was still, just kind of talking through some things. And, I could hear the panic in her voice. And so with her voice, when I went to the stairs, she was down at the bottom of the stairs saying, let's go. And I'm just like, what? So we left, I went ahead and left with her and stuff. And so her experience when she was there, she was kind of confused and she was mad as well. And so she had told me, she said, man, what have you told this lady about me? And I'm like, I ain't told her nothing. Like, they just found out I had a girlfriend and stuff. So I've never even discussed anything with her. And so, with my girlfriend, like her mother and her father had passed and stuff. You know, her father died when she was like 2, got murdered when she was 2, and then her mother died, I think, when she was like 11th grade in high school. And so she said that B1's mother like sat her down on the couch, and they sat down on the couch together, and she grabbed her hand and she said she was just looking in her eyes, and it's like she was looking past her eyes, kind of like she was just reading her soul. And she told her, she said, baby, even though your mom and your daddy's gone, you gonna be okay. And so that kind of sent her into like a panic for real. And she's like, you know, how does this lady know this stuff about me? And so that's why she had questioned me, like, what have you told her about me? And I'm like, I didn't tell her anything about you. And so, you know, I remember us walking, you know, we got home and stuff, and she was just kind of bothered with that. So, you know, anyway, I made the connection going back to, you know, the whole purpose of going over B1's house. I made the connection with him. And so, you know, he gave me a little money, and then he gave me, you know, some weed and different stuff or whatever, because like I helped him get this connection and stuff. So, you know, in his gratitude for me doing, you know, what I did for him, you know, he looked out for me and stuff. And so I remember at this point when we had got our CDs together, like I quit smoking weed. I was like, you know what, until we sell a certain amount of CDs, I'm not getting high, I ain't doing none of this stuff. I'm just focused on like my grind and stuff. And so I just remember after probably about 2.5, 3 months of not smoking weed, you know, when B1 gave me this weed, I'm like, you know what? Like, I didn't have to buy it, this and that, you know, I've been off of it. So, you know, let me just smoke some weed again. So I remember that next day, we went over B1's house. I went over B1's house, and, you know, I grabbed some blunts and went over here, and, you know, not really hanging out with him in a while. I'm like, you know what, like, let's just kick it. And so B1 was like, you know, when I came in, he's like, man, what you doing? Like, you know, why you smoking weed now? And he said, I thought you quit. And I'm just like, I did, but, you know, I'm smoking today, right? And so, you know, B1 and B3 are in the room, and this is dating, but this was like we playing NBA Live and stuff. And so, you know, sometimes you get in your smoke sessions, and, you know, you just sitting around and stuff or whatever. So I was waiting for next because B1 and B3 was playing the game together. And so B2, he was still in his room just reading his Bible, doing whatever he did in his room. He just kind of isolated himself away from us. And so while I was waiting for this game to be played, B1 was super excited about me, you know, smoking again. And he's like, you know, hey, you know, if you roll up however many blunts you roll up, I'll roll up the same amount and we'll just match and stuff or whatever. So I'm like, okay, cool. And so, you know, I'm up there rolling the weed up and stuff. And then after I rolled the weed, they still playing the game. So, you know, what I decided to do was to draw a picture. And so, you know, I got some pen and paper and stuff, and I'm just sketching out, you know, a picture. And what I was doing was, it was our group name, you know, from the rap group that I was a part of. And so I'm drawing this picture. So B1 looked over, he seen me drawing. He was like, man, I didn't know that you knew how to draw. And I'm like, yeah, man, I can draw and stuff. I said, I'm the one who drew the logo on our album cover and stuff. And so B1 was like, he said, man, why don't you do me a favor? He said, man, why don't you draw a picture for me? And so back in the days, you know, I had a pager. And so, you know, my pager kept going off, and I'm looking at the number and seeing that, you know, here is my girlfriend. And I'm just like, I'm feeling like, dang, bro, I thought I wasn't gonna smoke again, but I'm smoking. But I just like, okay, here's the woman's intuition. She knew what I was doing. And so I'm just kind of like, you know, they never had phones in the house, so I couldn't call her back. And I didn't have a cell phone at the time. And so I couldn't call her back. And so, you know, I'm just like, well, I'm going to just smoke, do this or whatever, play this game and stuff, and then I'll be home in a little bit. And so, you know, when B1 seen that I was drawing, I'm taking you back to this picture. So when B1 saw that I was drawing this picture, he said, man, why don't you draw me he said, why don't you do me a favor? And I'm like, what's up? He said, man, why don't you draw a picture? He said, it's a picture that I got stuck in my head that I can't get out of my head. And so at this time, when he asked me to draw this picture, I'm just like, okay, cool, man. And I was going to another piece of paper. He was like, nah. He said, man, you don't even have to use another piece of paper. You can just use the one that you got. I said, well, I've already like drawn our logo up and stuff. He was like, nah, that's perfect, man. He said, just use this picture and stuff or whatever. He said, and then on this picture, you know, like you can just add to it. And so I'm like, okay, cool, man. And so I just remember about to start on the picture. And B1 grabbed my hand basically and was like, hey man, he said, you got to put your heart into it. He said, if you don't put your heart into it, it ain't gonna work. And I'm just like, hold on, what? Like, but he was just serious and stuff. And so when he told me that, I'm just like, okay, man, cool. You know what I'm saying? I told him, I said, man, I put my heart in everything I do. He was like, nah. And he was just like looking like serious. And dude was like, bruh, he said, if you don't put your heart into it, it's not gonna work. And so I'm like, okay, man, let me change my mind up. Let me change the way I'm thinking or whatever up. And so, man, like the picture that he had me to draw, as I'm drawing this picture, like I done drew a bunch of pictures before. And so this picture just seemed like it was just different from every picture. It almost felt like it was coming to life. And so I'm gonna spread the details of the picture and stuff. Like, I don't want the stuff really put out there and stuff, the things that was in this picture. But there's a few people I told on a personal level on some of the stuff or whatever, but I don't want the stuff put out there of what's on the picture, and I don't want people trying this stuff. But anyway, there was a few different things that he had put in this picture. As we was walking through this picture, he said, man, I want you to do this, I want you to do this, I want you to do this. And all of this stuff was in the picture. And he told me, before I started this picture, he said, man, the picture that I'm having you draw, he said, man, this picture is, he said, sometimes when we smoking, or sometimes, when you over at the house and you wake up and I'm just smoking and I can't go to sleep. He said, this is the picture that I got in my head. And so at this point, B2 had came out of his room and came into the room where we were at, right? And so B2 is telling him, hey man, like, don't do this to him. You know what I'm saying? B1, don't do this to him. And so B1 is looking at B2 and said, man, what you mean don't do it to him? He said, B1 said, man, didn't nobody care when my sister died. Didn't nobody care when mama did it to me. And I'm just like, like what? And so to kind of fill you in on, B1 with his sister in this situation, what he's talking about. So I can remember being out with B1 and somebody mentioned his sister, and B1 be ready to just snap. And, it's times where he just, almost off people and stuff or whatever. And, I've seen him just slap people over just even mentioning his sister and stuff, So I'm just like, man, this is kind of crazy. But I knew that he had a sister that had passed away, but I didn't know really what had happened to her and stuff. When he said that to B2, he said, man, didn't nobody care when my sister died. Didn't nobody care when mama did it to me. And so B2 was just pleading with him, hey man, don't do this to him, don't do this to him. And I'm kind of clueless, but at this point, B1's attention went from playing the game with his brother, and he was looking at the picture that I was drawing. There was a few things that he asked me to draw in this picture and stuff. And so I just remember B1 and B2 kind of going back, being argumentative toward each other. And so it almost felt like to me that B1 was trying to get me to do something, and then B2 was trying to protect me from this situation. I just remember like B1 looking at the picture as I'm drawing this picture and stuff and getting into this picture. But I also had questions as I'm drawing this picture, because some of the stuff that was happening in this picture was just kind of crazy to me. The whole time as I'm going back and forth with drawing this picture, my page is steadily going off, and it's my girlfriend. And so she's paging me like crazy. She probably paged me 10 times during this time. And so I just remember, like, as I'm thinking about it, like I remember just being over at the house, and, the rooms where his mother stayed at was always dark. It was always candles lit. It was always a bunch of different stuff in there. Like it always stayed real dark and stuff in there, man. And his mother, long black hair, always wore a lot of black and stuff. And I never really put that together as like, being anything crazy. My first inclination was, when my girlfriend had said that, it felt like she was getting her mind read and stuff by her. And so, it's still just kind of, I don't know, at that time, everything wasn't really registering. And so going back to this story, I remember B1 getting so excited because I was drawing this picture, and he kept taunting B2 like, man, you about to see how strong our clique really is. You know what I'm saying? And he was just like, man, we got a few minutes. And by this time, B1's excited. He's walking through the room, and, he's looking out the window, and he's just taunting B2 like, man, you about to see how strong our clique really is. And so as I'm going through this picture, I just remember one part that I shared with you. There was a lot of things that was going on, and he was having me draw this picture of, just kind of symbolic of some raindrops falling into some fire and stuff, right? And then so one of the things that he was saying was, make a big eye, right? And this big eye, I was like, man, what you mean, like a eye, like the letter I or something? And he's like, nah. He was like, the eye, like the eye on your face and stuff. And so I'm like, man, that's kind of weird, draw this, like he was saying, draw this stuff falling into this fire and stuff. And so for me, I had questions, and I remember B2 just like, man, B1, don't do this to him, don't do this to him. And so I'm like, man, what is this, man? I'm asking questions. What is this? B1's not answering, and B2 is like, man, I can't tell you. You got to figure it out on your own. He said, but one thing that I can tell you is who is the eye in the sky that's always watching you. And so I'm like, hold on, is he talking about God? So I didn't really know. And so I remember looking at B1, and, B1 was taunting B2, like, man, you about to see real quick, man. We only got a few more minutes left. And so I remember like asking him, I said, man, hold on, B1, like who is the eye in the sky? I said, man, is this about God? And B1 looked at me like I'm talking about the look on his face was just like crazy. And he was like, God? He said, man, I don't F with God. But it was in the sense of like, not that I don't get on God's bad side, but like me and God just don't roll together. And I'm just like, dang, bro, it's kind of crazy. You know what I'm saying? So I told him, I was like, hold on, bro. Like, I'm not playing with this. I said, here, man, you draw the picture. You finish it up. And I just remember B1 getting to the point, and he just calmed down and stuff. And he's like, nah, man. He's like, if you don't finish it, it's not going to work. You got to be the one to finish it. And he was like, man, I'm going to tell you, this stuff is so good that, man, you can use this for your next album cover. He was like, matter of fact, you should use this for your next album cover and stuff. And I'm just like, bro, like, what? You know what I'm saying? And so I just remember at this point with B1 and B2 going back and forth, kind of seemed like over this picture and stuff, and over, B1 trying to get me to do this picture. I remember like looking and saying that, you know what, man, here, bruh, like you do it. And he was like, I can't do it. You got to be the one to do it. And so I was like, yeah, I'm good, man. You know what I'm saying? So I took the picture, ripped it up, threw it in the garbage and stuff. And I just remember B1 getting upset, like he was mad. And so, he's probably, 6'3", 6'4", something like his big dude. And so I just remember him getting mad and was like, he was kind of directing it at me and B2. And he was like, hey, man, he was like, forget it, man. He said, man, I'm going to be the one with all the fame, all the money, all this stuff or whatever. He was like, and y'all ain't going to have nothing. And I'm just like, bruh, like, this is crazy. This is stuff that I had thought through myself, right? And so, like, when he said that, I'm going to be the one with all the fame, all the money, all the girls, all this, man, and y'all ain't going to have nothing. And then he pointed to his brother, and he was like, plus, I already talked to God, and God told me after I, off dude, he said, man, all I got to do is repent. And when he was saying off dude, I remember him telling me about, the guy who had, taken his sister's life. He was saying when dude gets out of prison or whatever, I'm going to, do something to him or whatever. And so that's what he was referring back to. And he was like, he pointed to his brother and was like, I already talked to God, and God told me after I off dude, all I got to do is repent. And I'm like, man, I wasn't a Christian. I didn't know none of this stuff. And so for me, I was just like, what the heck? Like, what is all this stuff, man? So it just seemed like these two was arguing without me. And so I just remember grabbing my backpack, grabbing my stuff, my CDs and stuff. And I'm just like, you know what, I'm out of here, man. And I remember walking out the room. And as I was walking out of the room, I remember B2 just reached his hand out, and he was like, everybody called me Daddy, but he was like, man, Daddy, bro. He was like, I love you, man. And I'm just like, it's kind of weird because B2, his personality was not like that. You know what I'm saying? And so, he had a lot tougher personality, but I just remember him reaching out, and it just almost seemed like a godly presence or something, right? And then so I just remember B1 looking at B2, almost like, hold on. And he was like, Daddy, I love you too. So at this moment, I got two hands reaching out. It seemed like good and evil. And I didn't touch either hand, man. I just kind of put my hands up and walked on out of the room. And as I went down the room and stuff, and I just remembered the way I used to leave out of the house was go out the back door. So I left out the back door, and I just felt like I heard his mother or something like scream or whatever, like a pop, almost sounded like a gun pop. And I was like, dang, I need to go back in here. But I felt like everything was pushing me away from not going in. And so I'm like, yeah, I'm not going back in here. So I'm heading on out. And so, you know, as I'm walking out or whatever, I didn't have a car. I was catching the TARC and stuff, the public bus. And so I remember going on to the bus stop. And when I was on the bus stop, just waiting for the bus to come, like it wasn't too far from the house. You could still see the house from the bus stop. And so when I'm out here, I just remember like a car pulling up. And when the car pulled up, I seen a guy in the car. And I'm like, the distance that we were apart, I knew that this was B1 in the car. And so when the car pulled up, I'm seeing him in the car and I'm just like, am I tripping? You know what I'm saying? Dude that pulled a mask off. And so like pretty much, you know, I seen him, like he had gloves on and stuff. So I seen B1 in the car. And so I seen this car pull up. And when I seen the car pull up, like here's like B1 driving this car. It's like I was so close, I know it was B1 in this car. And so as I'm getting close to the car, I seen B1 pulling gloves off, and there was another guy that we rode with that was in the passenger seat with him. And I'm just like, I walked up to the car like, man, what's going on? And I'm telling you, like, as I got close to this car, I could see when he took the gloves off, he's waving me back like, don't come to the car. I just remember as I got to the car and stuff, it was just like, you know, dude's face, B1's face just like completely changed and stuff, right? And so it changed to a guy that, like, you know, I didn't really know, but, you know, we kind of had, you know, we would see each other all the time. And, you know, it was just kind of tension in the air. I don't know if you ever had experiences with people like this, like, you know, you don't even know the person, they don't know you, but you just kind of feel like it's tension there. And so his face changed to this guy, and the car just like sped off and stuff. And I'm just like, bro, what the heck? You know, at this point, I'm like, bro, I need to find somewhere where some light at, because if something happens to me, I just need to be in the open so somebody can see what's happening at this moment. So I remember walking down the street, you know, probably about a block away to another bus stop that had a bunch of light in it. I mean, a bunch of light around it. So when I get to this spot, you know, I'm just on the bus stop and I see a car sitting over there. And I'm just like, man, it just looked like people in this car just like talking or whatever and probably pointing at me and stuff. And I'm like, man, am I just paranoid or what? And then so as I'm sitting on the bus stop, I see a payphone. I'm like, okay, at least I can use this payphone, you know, to call my girlfriend and tell her, hey, I'm on my way home, you know, just kind of update her and stuff, right? And so I put money in the payphone wasn't working. And so I just go right back to the bus stop. And as I get on the bus stop, I'm still looking at this car that's across the street. And then the lights on the car just come on. And when the car came around the corner, it almost hit me. And I'm just like, bro, like what the heck is going on? I'm kind of tripping at this point. And so I walk to another bus stop. And so I get to this other bus stop. And mind you, I'm right around the corner from like my grandmother's house, and my grandmother lived like a couple of blocks over, but nothing in me was like, go over your grandmother's house. I was still just trying to get back, you know, to my girlfriend's house. And so, you know, I remember going to another corner and I seen a guy that, you know, we grew up with, and I told him, hey man, you know, we got our music and stuff out, man. And so he was like, ah man, that's dope, man, because I hadn't seen this dude in a while. And so, you know, going through this situation and stuff or whatever, man, there's another guy who just like walked up, and while me and my friends talking, and me and this guy just locked eyes on each other. And so, you know, as dude walked past, he got his hand behind his back, but I also, at this point, I kept a little gun and stuff on me. And so I had my hand in my backpack, like on my gun, like, man, if something happened, then it's going down. And so he walked, I remember him walking right in between me and his kid and stuff. And I remember me and the kid looking at each other like, man, who is this, man? And he was like, the kid asked me, he said, man, do you know dude? And I'm like, nah, I don't know him. I thought you knew him. And he was like, nah, but we looked up and like, dude was gone. So I just remember looking up and seeing the bus coming, right? And so I remember looking at my pager and stuff, and my pager said like 9:41 or something like this or whatever. So, you know, going through this, man, I get on the bus, head on home, and I had to walk a little distance and stuff to get home after the bus dropped me off. And so I just remember going to our apartment, and the way our apartment was set up, we had like 3 flights of stairs. So there was a person, it was like old Louisville area. So it was a person who lived on the first floor, person lived on the second floor, and we lived on the 3rd floor. And so I just remember like going down here and getting to the apartment, and I opened the door, and as I'm opening the door, I'm looking down, and I see like drips and almost like little puddles and stuff, but it's dark outside, I really can't tell. And so as I walked in the apartment, I'm seeing trails like drips and stuff, right? And these drips are just leading up to like the second floor. And so the floors are like a burnt orange color. So in my mind, I couldn't tell if it was just water, if it was, the burnt orange was, making the floor look red and stuff, or what, I couldn't tell. And so, I see these drips going all the way to the second floor. It didn't stop at the second floor, it's going all the way to the third floor. And that's the floor that we lived on. And so when I get to the door, it's like a puddle of blood and stuff right there, a puddle of red stuff. I just say that, but I think it's blood, whatever. And so I get to the door. When I open that door, all I'm thinking is that, man, these dudes done broke in here, found out where I lived, and done something to her. And all I could think was my get back. Like, dude, like, I'm finna tear some stuff up. You know what I'm saying? My girl, they didn't kill my girl without, they didn't done something to my girl, and then my son and stuff, she's pregnant with my son. So I remember like getting in the apartment, and I remember going to the room because I was calling her name. And so, she wasn't answering. And when I got to the back room, she just on the bed, like just crying and stuff. And I'm like, man, why are you crying? So she was just like, she told me the whole story of why she was paging me and stuff. And I was asking, I said, man, who's been up here? And she's like, nobody's been up here. I said, man, did you take the trash out? She's like, no. I was like, and I grabbed up. I'm like, man, what is this in front of the door? She was like, I don't know. It looks like blood. And so I'm just like, man, what was you paging me for? Why was you paging me? And she was just like, in her mind, she said, I just felt like you wasn't coming home. And she said, not that you wasn't coming back home to the apartment, but like you just wasn't going to be alive anymore. And I'm just like, what? Like, so she was just telling me she had this weird feeling the whole time. And that's why she started just, paging me and stuff the whole time. And so like when we just kind of put the stories together, like she had told me that, she was worried. She had this big concern. And she said at like 9:42, she said she felt like God had just told her, stop worrying and just pray. And so, at 9:40, like I said, I just remember looking up and seeing the bus had came. And I don't know if it was just because of her prayers that, all the commotion and stuff had died down and stuff like this, and the situation was over. But I do think that's the reason. And so, yeah, like going through this situation, like I said, I don't know fully what was the whole purpose of it and stuff, but I kind of felt like, in my mind, whatever stronghold or whatever, I don't know if it was a curse or something. I don't know, whatever dude was under, I think he had to, transfer it to somebody else for him to get out from under. I don't know how none of this stuff works, but I do feel like all of these situations was happening like backwards and stuff. And that's why he kept pointing at B2, taunting him, saying, man, we only got a few more minutes. You're about to see how strong our clique really is, because I just kind of felt whatever stronghold he was under, he had to find some way to put it on somebody else. And I think I was the person that he was trying to put it on. And I think it angered him when I ended up like not going through with it. And so, yeah, like, I don't know what this means. I don't know how it was. And I tell you this, like that next morning when we woke up, we didn't clean nothing up, but all of that stuff was gone from in front of the door and stuff. And so, yeah, the fact that she seen it, the fact that I'd seen it, we both experienced this stuff. Like, I don't know what it is. And so, spiritually, if somebody knows what this is, you can tell me. But yeah, I'm just telling you, like, I know how that stuff was. And the fact that, like, I remember being over my grandmother's house and just, halfway being lighthearted, but also serious, just kind of like, hey, you can take my soul for the money, for this, for the fame, and all of this type of stuff. And then the fact that dude got angered and he basically answered everything without me telling him any of the stuff I prayed for. He was like, man, F it. I'm going to be the one with all the money, all the fame, all this. You know what I'm saying? And like, it's kind of crazy. And the fact that, like I told you, like B2 kept telling him, don't do this to me. And he said, man, like, like F it. Like, man, didn't nobody care when my sister died. Didn't nobody care when mama did it to me and stuff or whatever. And so I just remember that playing in my head and stuff. So, like, my whole thing of just telling this story is just to let you know that spiritual things really happen. I don't know how it works all the way. I don't know, fully what happens in every situation, but I do know what happened to me, and nobody in the world can convince me what I went through was not real. And so, yeah, yeah, just saying that to say, like, some of these things that we experience out here, some of this stuff that goes on is controlled, like, just by like spiritual situations and stuff. And so whether you believe it or not, it ain't up to me to make you believe even what I just told you. You can think that I'm just out of my mind, I'm nuts or whatever, but I know what happened and I know how the situation went down. And I still don't know what it meant, but I know I just didn't go through it. I think I was right on the edge of, everything transpiring. But, at that moment, I just like, hey, man, I'm done. I'm not doing this stuff. And I think all of that stuff just kind of died down. So just understand that we are not in a world that is not controlled spiritually. Everything that goes on has some type of spiritual ramifications and stuff. And so there's a lot of things that are looking to destroy us in a lot of ways. So we just have to be careful as we navigate through it and just understand that, yeah, like we are dealing with real life and real things happen. And, the ultimate goal, I think, is to destroy us, and we have to be careful. So I'm not here to convince you of anything godly, demonic, any of that type of stuff, but I'm just telling you my experience. So I hope it helps. And so if you find this helpful to somebody, go ahead and share this video with them, and then also go ahead and like and subscribe to the channel. But yeah, like I said, I'm just telling you experiences, and I hope that what I say can help in some kind of way. And yeah. Anyway, I'm Damien, and until the next video, I'm out. Peace.